Welcome to the Bible Search and Rescue podcast. Bible Search and Rescue is part of the West-R Institute, home of the Jesus Seminar. My name is Chad Vinters. I am a West-R scholar and host of Bible Search and Rescue. And speaking of the Jesus Seminar, today we have distinguished scholar and participant of the Jesus Seminar, Brandon Scott. Brandon, how are you doing this morning?
Fine.
Excellent. So, we are going to begin a new series here on Bible Search and Rescue, looking at the wisdom of Jesus. And so we're going to be taking a look at some distinct aspects. We'll be looking at parables. We'll be looking at the Gospel of Thomas. And this morning, we're going to kick it off by talking to Brandon about Q and the Q Gospel. And so, Brandon, for those in our audience who are not familiar with what Q is, or have maybe just a basic knowledge, or they've heard it but they're not really sure, when you describe Q to people, what is Q, and how does one come to understand a little bit more about Q's origins?
Well, the Q is called Q from the German word Quelle, which means source. So there's no magic about Q. It's just an abbreviation.
Mm-hmm.
And Q is a hypothetical document. So the first thing you have to think about is, what's a hypothesis? And an hypothesis is a solution to evidence that doesn't make complete sense. So I'll give you, we deal with hypotheses all the time. We just don't recognize it. The weather report is a hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
The weatherman looks at all the data. He sees systems here, systems there. He gets radar reports. She gets all this kind of data. And then the person has to put it together and says, what's going to happen? Well, that what's going to happen is a hypothesis based upon the evidence. And the hypothesis is either good or bad. If it explains the data, then it was a good hypothesis. If it leaves things out, it's a bad hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
So we deal with hypotheses all the time. We just don't recognize it. If you look at a Greek New Testament, it's a hypothetical text.
Yeah.
We don't have any of the original documents. We're not even close. Okay, so it's a good 150 years after the supposed date of the writing of the New Testament did you get any documents that are substantial in size. So you have to reconstruct, that is, make a hypothesis, explaining the data you have to come up with a Greek New Testament. So hypotheses are frequently. Sometimes people say hypotheses aren't real. No, they're real. They're hypothetically real.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a different way of thinking about it. I always point out to my students, atomic theory is a hypothesis. The bomb goes off. Okay, so
Yes. And we all saw this in Oppenheimer, for all of us
that's
who
right.
watched Oppenheimer.
Now you may
Yes.
have another just different explanation for it. That is, you would have a different hypothesis, but the bomb still goes off. And if your hypothesis doesn't explain why the bomb goes off, it's a bad hypothesis. They could explain why the bomb went off. In fact, they predicted what would happen on the basis of hypothesis, and they were right. So it's a modern way of thinking. Okay, ancients don't think hypothetically. They think from the top down. They think truth is revealed, and so they try to find how that truth is evident in nature. We work the other way up. We gather all the things together, try to build a hypothesis. We go bottom up, they go top down. It's just a very different way of thinking.
Sure.
Now, the next question would be, why do you need Q? Why do you need a hypothesis? Well, that really goes back to Mark. If you think all the Gospels are eyewitness reports written by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, you don't need Q. You've got three independent witnesses. God revealed that they're truth, therefore these are true. You don't even have to question it. But does that explain the evidence that's in front of you? Okay. The problem is, when you look at the three synoptic gospels, A couple of things become evident very quickly. One, they all three have the same outline. Gospel of John does not. So obviously, John is different in some fundamental way. Now, if you think all four Gospels are eyewitness reports, why is John so different? So you already got a problem that needs to be explained. Why is John different? Okay, if you think they're all hypotheses. If you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all have the same outline. So, ooh, they agree. That looks nice.
Hmm.
When you look at the agreement, you begin to see that there are places where they don't disagree, that where they disagree. And if you look at those disagreements, they're basically of two types. One type is material that Matthew and Luke have in different places than Mark.
Mhm.
And when you look at that material, you see you never have a case in which Matthew and Luke agree against Mark. Matthew and Mark disagree against Luke, and Mark and Luke disagree against Matthew, but you never get Matthew and Luke disagreeing against Mark. That doesn't happen. That tells you something very important. Mark's the source because he's the one they always agree with.
Mhm.
The second piece of data you see is there's a lot of material that's in Matthew and Luke and not in Mark. And generally, they put this material goes in different places within the Markan outline. This gets more complicated, but one of the things you observe about that evidence when you look at it carefully is it's highly verbatim. They agree a lot. Normally, when you study oral traditions, when people agree word for word, it means they have a copy.
Mhm.
When they're kind of together, the gist is the same. Basically, you got oral tradition. That's a kind of rough rule of thumb. Okay. And this is tested out not just in New Testament studies, but all kinds of studies when you study oral culture.
Mhm.
So when you look at that, you say, okay, it looks like Mark is the source of this one group of material and of the outline, and that Matthew and Luke have another document that's primarily sayings about which they agree upon very strongly. Therefore, it looks like a written document.
Mhm.
Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think
All
it's
right.
tracking. Yeah.
So the reason why you have Q is because Mark turns out to be the source of Matthew and Luke.
Mhm.
If there are three independent sources, you don't need Q. You just need three independent sources.
Right.
If there are three independent sources, this is the kicker, somebody is lying.
Yes.
Okay. Because how do you explain all these differences and how do you explain John? They can't all be this right.
Mhm.
If you go back and read old 19th century lives of Jesus, they will have, you know, two walking on the waters because one occurs in one place and the other occurs in another place. I mean, they have to multiply all this stuff. And they try to explain why the synoptics have 1 year ministry and John has a 3 year ministry. Well, John started. I mean, you have problems with dating. I mean, they are infinite. You're just creating more and more problems. No,
Mhm.
this is where Occam's razor comes in. Occam's razor is, the simplest answers generally the best. And conspiracy theorists need to remember Occam's razor.
Yes.
So the simplest answer is somebody's lying or there's literary dependence.
Mhm.
Literary dependence explains more of the data than independent eyewitness accounts does.
Mhm.
So,
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think something to keep in mind as well for those because a lot of our folks who maybe tune in or who are still like trying to sort through some of these issues regarding critical analysis of the Bible, because many people grow up in churches or in backgrounds where that's not even something you do, right? You just accept that there is this, I call it the gospel smoothie, right? Which is that all the gospels say the same thing and you just blend them together like you're talking about, and they all just somehow streamline. When looking at something like Q, for example, another I think important point for people to remember is that these documents, or in a case the Q, it's hypothetical, that's verbatim Greek language. Would you have expected Jesus to be delivering these discourses in Greek in his lifetime?
Well, he didn't deliver any of these discourses.
Okay. But to go,
Okay.
yeah, but
So,
yeah, right. So, well, yeah, so we'll get to the historical Jesus component in a second.
um,
But would you have expected Jesus to be delivering discourses in Greek, or would you think he would be doing it in Aramaic or something else?
well, not Hebrew.
Okay.
Hebrew is basically a dead language at this time, except among certain elites.
Hmm.
And Jesus is an elite. Jesus belongs to the peasant class, and his followers belong to the peasant class. That's what's really so different about Paul. He belongs
Hmm.
to an elite. So they're different social classes. That's always important to keep in mind.
Yes.
The second thing is uh, Jesus and his folks are in Galilee. Galilee is a conquered area.
Hmm.
There are Roman cities, colonies all around. Colonia, all Caesarea Philippi
Hmm.
is a Greek city. Okay, so it's possible. I think it's highly possible that Jesus and his group uh, know some Greek.
Hmm.
How much Greek? Hard to tell. Conquered people tend to learn the language of the conquerors.
Hmm.
Um, you know, there's lots of evidence on this. So it's possible that in a craftsman sort of way, that Jesus and his group know how to get along in Greek. And if you look at the parables, for example, the wisdom tradition is not very high Greek.
Hmm.
It's pretty elementary. So is it possible that they were always in Greek? Maybe.
Hmm.
Uh, you know, what I would like to do is leave the question open. If
Okay.
you look, if you look at Jesus in his social situation, there's a good chance that he and his group can handle some Greek,
Hmm.
um, and maybe quite a bit of Greek. Now they're not fluent; they're not reading Homer, they're not, going to rhetorical school, but you know, they can be pretty sophisticated. They could potentially be fairly sophisticated in the Greek. But Galilee is a very mixed area.
Hmm.
One interesting piece of information there is that most inscriptions that we have from the first 3 centuries in Galilee are in Greek.
Hmm.
The majority of them are. Even tombstones of rabbis are in Greek, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So, so you have to kind of stop. We always, oh, he's Aramaic. Yeah, I assume he was raised in Aramaic culture. He speaks Aramaic, but could he handle Greek? Very likely,
Hmm.
especially if the
Hmm.
tradition is true that he's a carpenter. That means he's
Hmm.
got to get along with people who are going to employ him who would have spoke Greek.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's really interesting because it adds an additional layer to this regarding questions. Because, like you talked about, there's this sense of verbatim agreement between this material found in Matthew and Luke that would be qualified as Q material, and questions also regarding how much of this would have been translated or how much of this was part of a tradition or whatever else. And so the fact that they are tend to be verbatim in the Greek language is very notable in that
Well,
sense.
well, it means Q is written.
Hmm.
First thing is that it was,
Exactly.
and then it's written in Greek.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, were these sayings translated from Aramaic at some earlier period? Could be. But the tradition might be bilingual from the beginning.
Sure.
That
Yeah.
ought not to be ruled out.
Yeah. And it definitely, like you said, it creates the issue of eyewitness testimony creates so many problems. And one of the things that when folks talk about, well, it's like seeing an accident at four people seeing an accident, right? Okay. So here's the inherent problem, especially when you talk about the idea of when inerrancy, so to speak, right? Is that if you had these four reports, you would assume that at least someone or multiple someone's got things wrong as part of those reports when you're reconstructing supposedly eyewitness accounts of it. That's what a law enforcement officer would do, especially in the case of someone like John, where John maybe says, well, no, that didn't even happen at all. Those are the kinds of things that you would look at and you would say, well, okay, so obviously someone is wrong. And for many folks who grew up in that sort of fundamentalist tradition, they kind of get these cliches, but sometimes they don't think about the ramifications of what that might mean for when you think about something like actual eyewitness testimony and so forth. Like you said, either someone is lying or someone's wrong whenever you start comparing all of these, uh, you know, eyewitness accounts, which they weren't. They were not eyewitness accounts.
Well, I mean, the tradition goes back. The problem is eyewitness count.
Hmm.
Okay, that's a modern concept. These people don't see things; they hear things.
Hmm.
These are oral cultures. They remember things. They don't see things. I'll give you a good example of this. When we get frustrated, we say, "Can't you see?" When Jesus gets frustrated, he says, "Those who have ears to hear, listen." Reality for him comes in through the ear. That's true for the ancient world. Reality for us comes in through the eye. It's a
Hmm.
very different set of metaphors. So we talk about eyewitnesses. They remember. The emphasis for them is on memory. And memory functions very different than the eye does. It's a whole different process, both in terms of how our brain works, but also hermeneutically and how we interpret things. It's just a different kind of functioning.
Yeah. All right. So now that we kind of have a background as to what Q is, let's talk about what is in Q. So when you describe the contents of Q, what really stands out to you about both what is there and what's not there?
Okay, the thing you know that most people know that is Q is the Sermon on the Mount.
Hmm.
Uh, Now, the Sermon on the Mount is not Q. There's a Sermon on the Plain in Luke,
Hmm.
which is really Q. But the author of Matthew has used the Sermon on the Plain and made it a much longer sermon
Yes.
and more intricate sermon, but it's based on Q. So that's what you see in the Sermon on the Mount is basically the first level of Q. It's wisdom material. Um, and that's that's fundamental to Q. It runs throughout the whole of Q. The other part of Q are there's apocalyptic material, some Son of Man sayings about the
Hmm.
Son of Man coming in the future. And those two are somewhat in conflict. Wisdom isn't too interested in the Son of Man coming. Apocalyptic isn't too interested in wisdom. So you have to think of there's been some addition to Q. Q has probably undergone some growth, which is very common in oral traditions. Oral traditions add things quickly because they don't have a
Hmm.
lot of structure. It's like having a set of filing cards. You can rearrange them however you want to and add cards in. You put a narrative structure in there like Mark, harder to add things in.
Hmm.
You have to rearrange things a lot more. Easier with a filing system.
Okay. Very good. All right. So you have these sayings, because you're an excellent parable scholar. What kind of parable material does Q have in it?
A week.
Okay. So it's predominantly, might we say, is it like aphoristic sayings that we
Yeah.
might? Okay.
The, you know, the best known parables in Q are the parables of the leaven and the mustard seed. They're Q parables.
Hmm.
Um, and it likes that short aphoristic parable. There's none of the long narrative parables
Yeah.
in Q. They come from other places.
Yeah. And I was
And
actually
I would
going
love
through.
to know the reason for that, by the way, but I don't.
Yeah. Well, there's so many questions we all have. So I was actually going through this. This is a good book, by the way, for people who are kind of interested in checking out. The Saying is Gospel Q in Greek and English. And if you're not a Greek reader, that's fine. The English side is there. But this was Robinson, Hoffman, and Kloppenborg who had an active role in the International Q project, which we can talk about in a second. But it shows the parallels between Q and Mark and Thomas, at least as they see it. What kind of parallels do you see with Q and other gospels or other wisdom literature?
Well, the strongest parallels are with Thomas,
Mhm.
the Gospel of Thomas, of which there's considerable parallels. For example, if you look at the Beatitudes, they're in Matthew and Luke and in Thomas. The same ones. Thomas has a collection of Beatitudes too.
Mhm.
Uh, it, we can actually look at those if you want to. Actually have. Can I share
Sure,
the
go for it. We can do whatever we want. It's our podcast. We have that kind of power.
so powerful? All right.
Hmm.
Here, can you see these?
Not yet. It's there we go.
Okay. So if you look here, you have Matthew, Luke, and Thomas. Okay. And these are this translation translates these as congratulations. But let's just look at Matthew's. Congratulations to the poor in spirit, the empire of heaven belongs to them. Luke, congratulations to you poor, the empire of God belongs to you. And Thomas, congratulations to you poor, the empire of heaven belongs to you. Now, if you just look at this one beatitude, Luke has the simplest one, and Luke and Thomas kind of agree. They're pretty close. He's
Hmm.
got the empire of God. This is the empire of heaven. Thomas hardly does not ever use the phrase empire of God. He always refers to the empire of heaven. That's his standard phrase. Matthew does the same thing, by the way, which
Hmm.
is a more Jewish phrase. And it might be more original, it might not be. Notice what Matthew's, he's made it poor in spirit. And Matthew has a tendency to spiritualize all these beatitudes. Uh, so we think those who hunger and thirst for justice, you
Hmm.
will receive mercy. He does this over and over again in the beatitudes. They're physical in Luke, and they become spiritualized in Matthew. And
Hmm.
generally, you would argue the simplest form is the earliest form. That's the kind of law. So, you know, this is probably Q. Luke is probably Q. Matthew has elaborated. Now, Matthew is making a great big sermon out of what's a smaller sermon in Luke. So, elaborating these things is to be expected.
Hmm.
Notice Thomas, for example. Thomas has two of these Beatitudes. He actually has three of them, and he has them in different places.
Hmm.
He doesn't have them collected it. So that tells you something that Luke collects them. These originally in the oral tradition were all separate beatitudes. And Q brought them together into one group, and Matthew expanded them even further. So expansion is what the tradition does. It's kind of um, I used to always, as a kid, if you had the priest come to church, you really come to supper, you really wanted someone else to pray because the priest would just go on and on and on. It never eats. The traditions expand. It's just in the nature of them, just the way they
Hmm.
work. They can contract, but generally they do. So you can see here a clear example. This is Q. This is pre-Q. Thomas actually preserves something older. Doesn't mean Thomas is older. Just in this case, he preserves an older tradition when these Beatitudes circulated separately. He's representing the oral tradition, and Matthew is showing you what a written tradition does. It expands
Hmm.
on that tradition, moves it more towards the spiritual, less away from the physical.
Very good. And by the way, so folks know, if you're interested, Brandon is showing us from the Complete Gospel Parallels. That's a West Star publication, Art Dewey and Bob Miller. And one of the reasons why this particular parallel is so good compared to, say, the synopsis of the four Gospels, is that this one actually shows books that aren't just in the New Testament. So you're going to get Thomas, you got the Gospel of the Hebrews, you've got any number of them. This is the one I use when I'm going through and I'm doing my analysis. This is a great resource if you're wanting to study gospel parallels.
Well, you mentioned Robinson's and Hoffman Kloppenberg's book, but Q is also in this parallel. So there's a whole section of the Q which with the parallels worked out to it. So you can see what various people do. It's actually, I think, better set up than the one in Robinson's.
Oh, I
Uh,
agree. Yeah,
but
no doubt.
this is it's well set up here. So
Yeah.
can I
All
point out
right.
just one quick thing? If you
Sure.
pop up here, notice here's Mark. And this column adds Mark here and Matthew here. Here. Okay. Uh, Jesus is preaching here. This follows in Mark, follows in Luke fairly close. And then both Matthew and Luke add a thing to introduce the teaching. Okay, seeing the crowds, he climbed up on the mountain and went down and sat down. Now, Matthew has a Moses parallel. He frequently
Mhm.
makes Jesus pose, so going up on the mountain makes him parallel. Luke doesn't. During that time, it came to pass that he went out on the mountain to pray. Luke likes to have Jesus pray a lot, so that's probably a Lucan addition. And on the way down with them, Jesus stopped at a level place, a plain. So
Hmm.
it's on the mountain in Matthew and on a level plain in Q. In Luke, he looks squarely at his students and says, over here, he addresses the crowds. So
Hmm.
you get a very different situation. When you look at the parallels, you can see easily who's doing what, and you can
Hmm.
figure it out. When you're reading an independent gospel by itself, that disappears. It's really hard to see that granular detail.
Yeah. Yeah. And something that's interesting, I'm glad you pointed this out. Something I find fascinating when you're talking about looking at those details is at the end of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, Jesus has this large crowd following him, and he heals a leper as he's doing this. And he tells the leper, don't tell anyone, which is really weird because he has a giant crowd around him. But it's, of course, because he then pivots back to Mark's material. And in
Right.
Mark, he doesn't come off of a big sermon. So it makes more sense. Those things get lost, though, once again, like you said, whenever you're not reading them comparatively. Very good. All right. So excellent detail. And just real quick, because we've mentioned Kloppenberg and Robinson of those guys, they were driving factors of the International Q Project. And the International Q Project, you can get the very detailed commentary on that. I don't remember. You weren't part of the International Q Project, were you?
I mean, the first part of it I was, but
Okay, not the final publication.
no.
Okay. What was the process like working through the material with the IQP?
Well, well, I mean, that was a large international group that was put together. Jim Robinson organized it. Um, and Kloppenborg was probably at the time the most important Q scholar around. His work on Q is foundational. It's really important. He has a little book on Q, the title of which slips me, which is really excellent. It's one of the best small books on Q that I know. I'll dig it up in a minute.
No worries.
Uh, and Robinson had headed the Nagamati project. He was the person who brought the text, critical text together and the translation. He's a great organizer. He was a great organizer. And Hoffman was one of the premier German scholars on Q. So and they brought a whole bunch of scholars together. And the idea was Robinson's, based upon the Jesus seminar. that they would go through Q and vote as to what was most likely in Q. So they used the same model of the Jesus seminar. They worked through it, pick pericope by pericope, and important scholars who worked on that material produced important papers making the argument. They would have an argument and discussion. In the end, they would vote, and that's how the book came together. So it's the exact same model that
Hmm.
Jesus Seminar used. And Kloppenborg and Jim Robinson were both members of the Jesus Seminar. So
Hmm.
uh,
Yeah.
it's
Speaking of the voting thing, we'll come back to that because we do want to get to the historical Jesus. But in thinking about the material in Q, what are some things, because sometimes with a text, it's not just what it says, but what it doesn't say. What are some things that stand out to you about what doesn't appear in Q?
well, there's only one. There's no miracle stories. There's only one healing story. So that's a bit odd.
Hmm.
And same thing's true in Thomas. There's none in Thomas. So that's wisdom just does not move towards that tradition,
Hmm.
towards the healing tradition. If you look at the fourth gospel, the earliest version of the fourth gospel is a signs gospel, a collection of signs that were named. So wisdom in John comes in later, not at the beginning of the tradition, but more in the middle of the tradition, and it's more esoteric wisdom. It's not
Hmm.
this kind of ordinary wisdom that you see in the. It's not. It's both ordinary wisdom and uncommon wisdom in Q. But it's not esoteric. It's not
Hmm.
moving towards what later becomes Gnosticism, or although that's a difficult word to use sometimes. But
Yeah.
yeah, so that's one thing that's kind of interesting. It's just simply not there. The
Hmm.
second thing, there is no narrative, so you don't have any beginning, middle, and an end. There's no story, um, and it's just a collection of sayings. Basically, there is a sermon, the Sermon on the Plain, but that's about all the structure it has. Thomas has even less structure. Thomas and Q both belong to what the ancients called the sentences of the wise, Sophion Logon.
Hmm.
So there's wise saying, and it's a way of collecting the sayings of a teacher. You just put them together. Book of Wisdom is this same kind of collection. Ecclesiastes, where you just collect the sayings. So this is a kind of way throughout the Mediterranean world of bringing together wisdom sayings. There's an ancient tradition of doing this. It's very flexible because it has no order, so you can push things in and out, rearrange things with comparative ease.
Hmm.
And its basic function is memory. It's a reinforcement for memory. So it's
Hmm.
where you can keep all the stuff. So
Yeah.
uh,
Short, simple. Yeah. Good.
yes,
Yeah. Little chunks that you
right.
can work with. Right. All right. So do you see anything in Q about Jesus's death or resurrection?
But there's nothing about the death. Um, Q certainly knows of the death of Jesus.
Hmm.
It talks about, the rejection of wisdom, how I would have, brought you, to, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you have killed the prophets. So it clearly understands Jesus as in that line of prophets where the prophets get killed. And that's the
Hmm.
way it understands it. So, but it doesn't make anything out of it. He's just one of a long list of prophets. I don't, pardon the word just. He's in a long list of prophets who got killed. So that's the way it understands
Hmm.
the death as part of this wisdom cycle. It's a Deuteronomistic theory that the prophets get killed, and Israel always rejects the prophets. The great prophets all get rejected.
Yeah. And I think in Q as well also contains the take up your cross and follow saying.
Well, probably,
Hmm. Yeah.
but
On
that
the edge.
doesn't mean that it's referring to crucifixion.
Hmm.
And it's certainly not. You're not quite sure what to make of that. If you got a crucifixion scene like you do in Mark, yeah, I can tell you what it means. In Q, what's it pointing to? We assume, oh, the crucifixion story, but does it know a crucifixion story? Not if Mark originates it.
Hmm.
you
Yeah.
know, um, and
Yeah.
it's
Well, and that's right. And that's one of the things that these kinds of questions, at least, for me, and I think I over the years when I've taught in churches or with groups that come from more traditional backgrounds, these questions have always been infinitely more interesting to me than the questions just of, well, it's all just true and accurate and you just kind of accept it. Digging into the nuance provides a tremendous insight into trying to understand not just the origin of the texts themselves, but also times where you can kind of see overlaps and expansion. And one thing that stands out to me is most people, when they think of the temptation of Jesus, the iteration that they predominantly remember is the Q version,
yeah,
and they remember the Matthew Q version because Mark's temptation is two sentences, right? It's just, or maybe even one sentence. I don't remember what it is in Greek, but it's just two little verses that he was tempted. I don't even think he fasted in Mark. He was just out
no.
there in the wilderness. But in Q, you get the more elaborate narrative about the three temptations, and Matthew and Luke order those differently. And so you get this fascinating sense of when you're looking at it, the way in which people remember those traditions. Like you said earlier, poor in spirit has held the day a lot better than poor.
Well, people don't know poor. They know the Sermon on the Mount. They
Yes.
don't know the Sermon on the Plain. You have the
Yeah.
same thing with the Lord's Prayer. They know
Hmm.
the one in Matthew,
Yeah.
Our Father who art in heaven. They don't know Father in Luke, which is just the one word.
Hmm.
So, and that's the Q version. That's the earlier version. So, yeah, Matthew is better known than Luke on that stuff. It's more memorable. It's mightier in some ways. Okay.
Yeah.
Were you going to ask a question about the temptation story?
Well, for me, I think it's fascinating. I would kind of like to get your take on it. What do you make of the fact that both Mark and Q include some sense of the temptation of Jesus in the desert, although they take very different approaches to it?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's a temptation story.
Okay.
It's a testing story.
Okay.
Okay. Um, and it, and that's an important distinction because that word periodzo in Greek means to test. That's its primary sense. It's also the word used in Matthew at the conclusion of the Lord's Prayer. Lead us not into temptation. I'm not interested in a God who's tempting us. What they're saying is, don't put us to the test. We can't take this anymore.
Hmm.
That's a very different notion.
Very.
Okay, not talking about leading into sin, temptation. It's talking about putting you to the test. And that's what's going on in the testing story. This is the testing of a hero. Is the hero up to the challenge of wisdom? So you can imagine the Q story as a test. I mean, the devil is kind of a super rabbi. Which one can quote the Bible better? I
Hmm.
mean, that's what they're doing.
Yep.
They're quoting text back like super rabbis. So one of the things to understand about this testing story is it's late in Q. It's after the destruction of the temple. It
Hmm.
knows the temple has been destroyed. So you're after 70. Rest of Q is prior 70. You know, so this was added at some time later to Q after 70. Uh, which shows these traditions grow. They're not
Yes.
static. We think printing press. When you print it, it's done.
Yep.
No, no, no. Not in the ancient world.
Hmm.
Matthew and Luke certainly didn't think Mark was done.
They did not.
They added to it. Okay. So these texts grow
Hmm.
because they live, they are written, but they live in an oral culture. And memory is more important than writing. A great example of this. In Cicero's debate, Cicero's a very literate person, more literate than anybody who writes a New Testament document, way above. We have arguments with Cicero about what the law says. It never occurs to them to go look it up. They argue from memory. Okay, so memory is more important than what's written. Written is to remind or refresh memory. It's not a replacement for memory. Okay, so what's going on in the testing story is this character, Jesus, worthy of being wisdom, of being the fount of all this wisdom that's coming? And so he bests the devil in this argument in a kind of super rabbi way. It's much more rabbinic than anything else in Q. Q in
Hmm.
general is not a scripture quoter as a text, doesn't really operate that way. So it's an odd story
Hmm.
in Q. It's an odd story in the gospel. Man, Mark is using it in exactly the same way. He just doesn't have a very big test, but he's using it to test: is the hero ready to go? Yeah, he's ready to go. So I mean
Yeah, and
that's his point.
that's about the detail we get too, right?
Yeah, that's
Yep.
that's that's his only point.
Yeah, he tested. All right, we're on our way. Off we go. And there's something really important about what you just said there. It's that shift in perspective. The reality is, what people have done in the modern world is they've taken the idea of the Gospels as being completely accurate, journalistically studied, or historically studied biography of Jesus, and they all nailed it because God was part of it, which is again, it's a bizarre thought process. But what you're bringing us back to is, if we really want to have a grasp of this literature, we have to stop thinking about it from modern concepts, or maybe even Baconian perspective or whatever, and start looking at it as it was in the time frame. And that's the beautiful example you just used is, Matthew and Luke certainly didn't treat Mark like infallible scripture. They treated him like a tradition that they felt free to redact as they looked through it, and they had other material, and they engaged as part of this. I don't know if it's a social dialectic or how one would describe that.
I suspect they thought it was either incomplete or wrong.
Yeah,
So I mean,
yeah,
or both. I don't know. I mean,
yeah.
we don't have access to that, but they don't. They certainly. I mean, they certainly don't. For them, it's a narrative, it's a story, and it's open to additions. It's open to revision.
Hmm.
So yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And that's very foreign for a lot of people's thinking because they've been
but
taught this one way.
well, I mean, I don't think that way of thinking about it is bizarre. It's just inappropriate.
Hmm.
Um, for two reasons. One of which is the kind of notion you're describing is a printing press notion. It's fixed.
Hmm.
It's in print. Okay. Fundamentalism is only possible in a print culture because only a fundamentalist would think you could have an inerrant text. The ancients know no text is correct. You know, in Cicero's letter to Atticus, Atticus writes back to him and says, "I just got one of your, I forget which one it was, something that Cicero had written. He said, I just got it and I finished correcting it." So, so what's he corrected against? He doesn't have an original. He just corrects it by what he thinks it should be. So, I mean, they don't assume it's right to begin with. So
Hmm.
that, and if you've ever worked with ancient manuscripts, you know they're full of errors. It's
Yeah,
copying is a difficult process, uh, especially in the ancient ones. Even difficult today, but it's really hard then. So
yeah.
they don't start with the assumption that you could be inerrant. That's just a foreign notion to the ancient world. There's always errors in the text. They they don't have trouble, and what they're concerned about is the inspiration that the text provides. They're much more inspired by how the text inspires than who inspired the writer.
Hmm.
That's they assume anybody who writes inspired. You have to be because it can't come from you. You're nobody. So it has to
Hmm.
come from on high. Remember, for them, truth comes from on high. For us, it comes from down here. So inspiration is natural to them. It's okay. It's just a different model of thinking about reality.
Yes, yes, and one we should expect considering it was quite some time ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So the last two things I want to hit on here. for wrapping up our session on Q today. Is the first will be when was Q written? And then the second, I want to come back to the question of the historical Jesus and how much of this actually even goes back to Jesus. So the first question, when do you think Q, at least in maybe its first layer, came into existence?
Yeah, I would distinguish three layers in Q: a
Mhm.
wisdom layer, an apocalyptic layer, uh, and the layer in which the testing stories got added.
Okay.
Okay. So that gives you the latest layer is after 70. And that's the version that of Q that Matthew and Luke use. Uh, somewhere, uh, I would assume this community is a Galilean community. Why? All the references are to Galilee.
Hmm.
So what few geographical references there are in Q, it's in Galilee. So it could be in northern Galilee, Syria, somewhere. It's Greek. It's Greek is decent enough that it doesn't look like it's been translated. There's not a lot of loan words from Aramaic in it. So it's
Hmm.
probably originally in Greek. It's scribal. These people know how to write. So it's kind of a scribal document. So that puts you in northern Galilee, Syria, small villages, somewhere their preaching didn't satisfy and they turned against the locals and they went to apocalyptic, that wisdom gets rejected, so the Son of Man will come and punish all you people. That's your second edition. I would assume the first edition is late 40s, mid 40s to mid 50s,
Hmm.
somewhere in that kind of roughly contemporaneous with Paul, but in Galilee and Syria, not in the Aegean. So it represents a kind of Galilean. Uh, I think the wisdom section in Q is pretty close to Jesus. It's about as close as you're going to get. Um, I think.
Excellent. All right. So with that in mind, what are some, and there's however you want to approach this is fine. I don't know if it's a percentage or are there some particular sayings of Jesus in Q that you think are actually from Jesus, or what are the ones that stand out? What are the ones that you don't think are Jesus, originated? What's your thought on that?
Well, the Son of Man sayings aren't
Right.
about the future. That those aren't Jesus sayings. Um, I don't think he's an apocalyptic, and I don't think in fact, I think Q is the best evidence for the fact that he's not an apocalypticist. It's one of the best. Um, I think blessed are the poor is right out from Jesus. Yours is the kingdom of God. That makes absolutely no sense in the traditional wisdom sense. Obviously, God blesses the rich. Wisdom tradition has been saying that for 300 years. And Jesus said, nope, it's not. That's Jesus. That's an underclass view. Elites
Hmm.
don't talk about that. That's and poor is not a tough enough translation. It's these are the down and out. Uh, these are the people that anthropologists talk about as the disposables. In the next famine, they're gone.
Hmm.
That's the group he's talking about, and he says those are the people that God sides with. Now that saying is a fundamental rethinking of the Hebrew tradition.
Hmm.
That element is in the Hebrew tradition, but it's a minor tradition in the Hebrew tradition. Jesus moves it right to the core of what's going on. Okay. And if we can get political, the Pope just brought it back up when he referred to Trump. Okay.
Yes, he did.
Okay. So I think one of the wonderful things about that Jesus saying is its place in the Sermon on the Mount means that the historical Jesus keeps coming back up, whether you want it to or not, because people will go to that and they recognize how radical it is. You don't have to make a big fancy argument, and it keeps asserting itself every time we say, oh, the Christ of faith, we go off and do this and this, and the historical Jesus in the back says, nope, it's all about the poor. So it reconcentrates attention. And that's what wisdom does. Wisdom reconcentrates attention on what's important. That's its point. So that's a great example of how wisdom works, why it grabs our attention, and why the historical Jesus keeps subverting people's view of the Christ of faith. It's right there in the text. You don't have to be very fancy about it.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, it seems like folks, at least in my experience, have been a lot more comfortable with that idea of blessed are the poor in spirit than they are the poor.
Now that's an interesting phrase. Lee Keck, who's one of my PhD teachers, he wrote an article a long time ago that said that what that phrase meant was what we would call depressed.
Hmm.
These are people who have poor spirit. They don't have a
Hmm.
lot of spirit. They're depressed. They're down. And if you look at it, the way Matthew has laid those beatitudes out, it makes it certain people who thirst for justice. These are people who are, getting beat up. These are not the people who are just not, this thing that they're poor in spirit. That is, they have a lot of things, but they're not attached to it. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about depression. I don't think depressed people feel like they're all that blessed. So
Hmm.
so that you think about that, really think about that phrase, it has quite a bit different impact than the tradition is made of it. The tradition
Absolutely.
wants to take the edge off. That's constantly what it does to Jesus. Brush
Hmm.
the edge off, making it acceptable. Nah,
Hmm.
it was not acceptable.
Was not acceptable. All right, so just to kind of wrap up here, are there any kind of like final thoughts or any recommendations you would make to people listening to this who are maybe interested in diving in a little bit more into Q, that in terms of like something to read, some of the more direct pieces? I think you had mentioned Kloppenborg's book earlier. Are you referring to Q, the earliest gospel?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
a really, really good book. It's easy to read. Uh, he is, in my judgment, the premier scholar on Q. He's the person who really broke it open. I mean, up until Kloppenborg, and Jim Robinson was part of this too, but Kloppenborg is the one that put it on the map. Q is simply a solution to the synoptic problem.
Hmm.
Kloppenborg brought it forth as representing a community, as representing a way of being a follower of Jesus in this early period. And that then gave us a way to rethink about how we understand the Jesus traditions uh, in the period between the death of Jesus and 70, the destruction of the temple. It really, really refocused the question. And that's a very accessible book. He takes you through it, gets you into enough detail, you get mildly lost, but you can come up for air. And it's really well written, and he really knows what he's talking about. It's a very good book. My number
Excellent.
one recommendation.
Number one. Okay, very good. And as we alluded to also earlier, you can get a copy of the complete gospel parallels from Westar. That's a good resource for being able to do the comparative work. And likewise, if you're not familiar, because the Brandon had showed that the complete gospels, it had probably some translations not necessarily all that familiar. So we might think of the Beatitudes as being more blessed are the poor, but we have congratulations. That comes out of the Scholars Version translation. That's what some Westar did that. You guys did that as part of the Jesus seminar, didn't you?
Yeah, prior it was we did it during that
Yeah.
because we needed a
So,
new translation. We wanted to get out. I mean, almost all modern translations are really another version of the King James.
mhm,
The King James is an excellent translation. I'm not arguing with the King James, but it's an old translation. English has changed. So we
mhm.
need a translation that is not in a biblical translation. Uh, I mean, we translate Koine Greek into biblical English. It doesn't make any sense. You need to translate it into Koine English, into common English. Look, what's the dynamic equivalent? Makarios really means that you're elevated in some extreme way for your good luck. Well, the poor don't feel that way, you
They
know.
do not.
So congratulations kind of gets at that sense. So that's what that's just a problem with translations. So
Mhm. Yeah. And another thing kind of in that same contrast is the way that the Scholars Version took the idea of woe to you, because people don't use woe I've never had anyone woe me, but damn you. right? It goes to that damn you. Fantastic. Because people will damn you, right? They'll do that on
Yeah,
a regular
or
basis.
worse.
Exactly. So, but the complete Gospels is another publication from Westar you can get that contains not just the New Testament Gospels, but it contains the larger corresponding. You'll have Peter, you'll have Thomas, you'll have the collection,
Q is in
and
that too.
yes,
Q
and
is
it
in
has,
there.
yeah,
And
yeah,
the
and there.
science gospel is in there,
Mhm.
which is the source for all the miracle stories in John. So it's pulled out and you can see what it looks like. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's a
So
very good source.
yeah, great resources for the study on this. Brandon, thank you so much for taking the time this morning to join us and to give
You're
us some
welcome.
insights into Q. And hope this has been insightful for all of you. Thank you for taking the time to join us this morning on Bible Search and Rescue. My name is Chad Vinters, and until next time, go out and make the world a better place for somebody else. Take care, everybody.